Hey there, this is Michael with OfficeRND and Jamie with Everything Coworking. Today, we're going to bring you an episode of Flex Academy focusing on managing your coworking finances. And with that, I'll let Jamie jump right into it.
Okay, Michael, this was the first thing that popped into mind for me because I
Okay.
see folks do this all the time. And I have to confess that when I opened my very first location, I did not hire a bookkeeper all the way. Right away. I thought, of course, I can do my own
You could do
books.
it yourself.
That's
It's just a little
easy.
bookkeeping.
That
Yeah.
no problem. Well, it turns out you have a lot of transactions every month because there's a transaction for every member and lots of, different
Or
things.
multiple
And
transactions for an individual member. Yeah.
multiple,
Yeah.
exactly. When I first opened, also there was no integration between like an Office R&D and QuickBooks, and
Oh
so
man. So it was all
now it's
manual.
so much easier. It's so
Yeah.
much easier for your bookkeeper if you're using a platform like an Office R&D that has that integration. But I think what happened to me was I was so busy with all the other things that we've been talking about in this video series, marketing, sales funnel, hiring, that I just got behind. And yes, I had enough cash in the bank to
Yep.
cover my expenses, but did I really know sort of what was happening in the business? No. So I
And this
finally
isn't the
hired.
most fun to do. So you put it
It's not
off last,
fun.
of
No, it was always
course.
like
Yeah.
the thing you pushed off. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at some point, I was like, oh boy, okay, this is a problem. I need to get caught up. And then you're way behind and you have to pay a bunch of fees to, get the months caught up that you haven't done. And certainly you don't want to do it around tax time because the bookkeepers don't have time. If you're in the US, I guess everybody has some sort of tax system. So anyway, just hire the bookkeeper, budget for it, and just hire them right away. Get them
Yeah.
to, understand your business and what the transactions look like, set up your chart of accounts appropriately, and you'll be in a good position to manage your
Yep.
finances.
This does not need to be a full-time bookkeeper. It should
Right.
not
Oh,
be a
no.
full-time bookkeeper when
Yeah,
you get started. This is a
totally.
part-time person that you only works hopefully a couple hours a month to make sure you're on top of things. And like Jamie mentioned, if you have certain softwares that sync with your accounting, whether Xero, QuickBooks, it's going to make their life a lot easier and your life easier because you're not going to have to sit with this accountant for 3 hours a month explaining to them what every single invoice is. And that's a real thing that can happen when you don't have an integration in your software, and many people have lived it. So I think we covered how important it is to get a bookkeeper when you first start. Anything else you want to add here, Jamie?
You know what? One more thing, because you made me think of this. The other
Perfect.
great thing about hiring a bookkeeper, and this person is like $250 or $300 a month. It's not a major expense. But if you're one of those people who's like doesn't love to dig into the numbers, and you tend to, not have that accountability, the bookkeeper can be like an accountability partner. When you said, oh, meet with them. Yeah, you could do a quick half-hour meeting with them once a month when they've got the updates done for that month and they've sort of closed the books, and review your key numbers. I do that with my bookkeeper, and it's perfect because even though I love numbers, sometimes it's easy to let that slide. So
Yeah,
it's kind of a forced accountability. So another reason
that's a
to
great
hire a
point.
bookkeeper right
That's a
away.
great point. All right. Next slide. Managing to a profit goal. Jamie, do you want to tell us a little bit about a break-even analysis?
Well, I think so when you first start off, it can
Yep.
take time to get to break even. So that depends on a lot of things. Do you have free rent built in? Do you have reduced rent built in? Have you pre-sold? How does your ramp up go? How are you doing on occupancy? So it can take time to get to break even.
Yep.
And you want to know sort of, how long that's going to take. And you want to know what your profit goals are eventually, and sort of be able to check that gap every month as you're working on getting to break even. But I will say, be patient. If you're a newer operator, it can take like 18 months to get
Yeah.
to
On average.
stabilization. Yeah, yeah, where you feel like, okay, this is good. This is what I thought my pro forma was going to look like. And it took 18 months to get there. So yeah, I mean, the break even is just really understanding, how much revenue do you need to cover your costs, like rent,
Yep.
staff, all the things that are in your P&L, and they can be a little bit tricky to guess, but if you sell a certain number of offices, a certain number of dedicated desks or meeting room time, and this is why, tracking is going to be important, like what's selling well, what can you sort of double down on to get to that break even point and continue to build that revenue number.
Yeah, and Jamie touched on it, but there's a couple key stats that you really need to find and understand that break-even analysis. The first one is going to be your fixed cost, and those are things like rent, like basic utilities, and they remain more or less constant every single month, regardless of how many members you have. The next thing that you need to understand and track are your variable cost. Those are things like amenities, payroll for your employees, and they can go up or down every single month. And then finally, another thing you want to be able to track is average revenue per member. If you can track all of those things and then have a good handle on your expenses, which will, those are your expenses. But if you can have a good handle on those things, and track them with your revenue, it's going to make understanding the break-even point much, much easier. Awesome. So, as we talk about average revenue per member, it obviously shows how important tracking is and tracking that revenue by specific product categories. Jamie, do you want to take us away a little bit on how important this is and how spaces can do this?
Yeah, it's super important. And Mike, you could speak more to this, but if you're using a platform like OfficeRND, then it helps you do that kind of automatically because it tracks your sales by your inventory, which is loaded into the system. I think the most important thing here is, especially when you're newer and even things can change in a market. So even if you've been operating for a while, is really knowing what's driving your revenue. And we see, Mike, I'm sure you see this with the operators that you talk to who are, new or have been operating for a while and are, talking to you about their business, is people will make assumptions about what's going to sell well in their market. And then sometimes they're a little bit surprised. And you need to know kind of where to double down on in terms of marketing. Your offices drive probably most of your revenue if you're an office-based business. Flex memberships, tend to drive like the vibrancy of the space and the community. But at, $200 a pop, it takes a whole lot of them to, add up to help you get to that break-even point. Meeting rooms has been really in flux, after the pandemic, and tends to be growing for some markets. So like we talked about marketing strategies in our last video, meeting rooms is something I'd really focus on. I'm getting on a tiny tangent, but
that's okay. It's a good one. It gets people in the door.
Yeah. And so if there's opportunity, like people in the business or in the industry are really talking about meeting room growth. Okay, can I invest a little bit more in SEO, or maybe I run some Google ads against meeting rooms? And if you're tracking that, as a product category, you can see if that investment pays off and if that's growing and something you might want to double down on a little bit. Even turning an office that you can't sell into a meeting room, and things like that. Events, that can take time to ramp up too. Events are doing really well for folks who have larger gathering spaces, meeting spaces, and knowing sort of, how much to invest and focus on, because you could host one, $5,000 event, which sells as much, as much revenue as, all of your Flex memberships, for example.
Yeah.
So you really want to know like
what's,
what's driving the revenue and profitability of your space.
Yep. Yeah. And just to add on to that, Jamie touched on it briefly, but whatever co-working software platform you are using should be able to do this natively. If it cannot do that, that's a big problem. I would look at one that does, and most of them do. But at the end of every single month, you should know and need to know exactly how much of your revenue came from all these specific different products. So that's so important. And it's definitely something to keep an eye on so that, as Jamie said, you can market correctly and target those correct people that are bringing you the money you need. And then we talked about this briefly, but we want to get into tracking your expenses and creating policies at your space.
Mike, do you know what came up for me when I was thinking about this? Is I had a community manager who was in charge of planning member events. And I don't know if I like checked the shared email or saw something like the order and the amount of money she was spending. We're hosting a lunch, and instead of ordering like pizza, I can't remember what it was that she picked, but it was like $50 a person, something
Was
crazy
this one
that
of
you
your
would not.
community managers, or is this
This
the
is one of
space you're
my
talking
community
about?
managers. Yes.
Oh my
And
God.
I was like, oh, I see. Okay. Well, we've never talked about, I guess, maybe I hadn't been explicit about like what a per person budget might look like.
Yeah. You
So
hadn't documented the process yet,
I
like
had
we
not
talked about a
documented the
couple episodes
process.
ago.
Right. So those kinds of things, like, it's kind of a detail. And I was excited that she wanted to plan the event, kind of let her run with it. Then I was like, oh, I see. We need to set some boundaries here. So, policies around expenses, even things like replacing inventory, like where are we ordering from? What's our inventory list? Where do we source that from? How much should we be spending? If there's an expense that's over X amount, you want your manager to, get approval. You want to think through those details and document them for your team so that there's no confusion.
Yep.
And then the emergency fund, I don't know if you had one when you were operating. We had, in my second location, had a pretty substantial one, which was really helpful. And actually, we were open at the beginning of the pandemic. And so that came in handy because we had some things that we needed to fund. It was helped me really sleep well at night, knowing that we had a couple of months of expenses in the bank. Because, there can be variability in the business, in
There
demand.
always
Yeah.
is
And
variability. I mean,
so
you'll
when you
have
have,
a window break, you'll have a toilet break, you'll have a door break. I mean,
yep,
things are going to break. Things
or
are
one of your,
um
big offices leaves and
falls
you can't
through. Yeah,
replace it
yeah.
right
So
away, or yeah. So you want to have that buffer. So, when you first open, if you can have that capital set aside, or you try to build it up, as you go along, to have that in place, it can be really good for your mental health to have that in
yeah,
place.
yep.
Mike, anything you want
And
to
then
add here?
finally, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you really we touched on it earlier, but it's so important that you're tracking your expenses and your revenue, but really tracking all of this stuff so that you can make more driven decisions, so you can set policy and ensure that when your operators or when your community managers are running the space in the future, they're treating all of these expenses correctly. So I think that's about all I had, Jamie. Is there anything else you want to add before we shut this one down?
I would just add one more thing about the data-driven
Yeah.
decision making, because I think it's easy when you're in the space to sort of make decisions based on like what you feel or intuition, or just not like, or what you prefer or what you thought was going to happen. One example that comes to mind for me, when in my conversations with operators when we do our monthly calls, a common like thing that happens is people will assume that they're going to sell dedicated desks, and then they have 20 of them and half of them sit empty. And
Yep.
some markets sell dedicated desks really well. This is just kind of an example. But if you're sitting there and you're looking at, okay, what percentage of my revenue is dedicated desk, or what's my occupancy on a dedicated desk, and what did I think it was going to be based on my pro forma? Okay, how do I make up that gap? And so some data driven, okay, I have to be honest here. Like the data says, I'm not selling these things and I got to do something. So we have one member who's putting up the very like pods, so they don't have tops. They're not going to sell like exactly as an office, but it's kind of like this in between solution. They lock, there's a door, it gives a
Okay.
sense of privacy. So again, we talked about kind of, always be testing. So she's looking at her data and saying, okay, my dedicated desks simply are not selling. It's been long enough. So I'm going to create these like office pods and sell those. So she's tested some and those are doing well. So she's investing in additional pods. So just kind of an example of like, your product mix and looking at the numbers and saying, okay, what's my gap to get to my target profit number? And, what can I
Yep.
do to get there?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting with those pods. Yeah. Dedicated desk. They've always, in my opinion, been hard to sell. Some people are good at it and can do it, but I never was that good at selling them. But yeah, I've seen more of these like we've talked about it, micro offices, little pods
Yeah.
like that really
Yep.
start to take off because people like that privacy when they come in.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, I think that about wraps it up for our episode today on managing co-working finances. Thank you guys all so much for joining us. We're planning to make a couple more in this Flex Academy series, and we will see you guys on the next video. Thank you.